in part because so much time has passed since the conference was organized. I first got to know Gilad because he edited this great volume on heresy that was published by the Brother. So if you haven't seen that, you should look at that. And in a certain sense, this paper this morning is somewhat of a continuation of my essay from that volume. The title of the paper is called The Theologico-Political Predicament and the Crisis of Heresy, Leo Strauss and Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar. So it's changed a little bit since we first started. It is largely autobiographical and widely read preface to the English translation of Spinoza's Critique of Religion, published in 1965. Leo Strauss famously describes himself as in, quote, the grip of a theological or a theologico-political predicament. The reference may have been to Spinoza's theological-political treatise that he was about to examine in detail, but the turn of phrase was not new for Strauss and has a much deeper and broader implication. As Strauss articulates it, this predicament is the very crux, one might say the crisis of Jewish modernity. For anyone who takes both Judaism and modernity seriously within the purview of their incompatibility. It's a predicament of tradition and heresy. Strauss often substitutes terms like orthodoxy or revelation for tradition and atheism for heresy. In an earlier 1952 essay, Progress or Return, the Contemporary Crisis in Western Civilization, Strauss frames his discussion as one of progress into the heretical predicament of modernity, or return to the rationality founded on revelation, which he believed was best represented in Judaism by Maimonides. As I'll try to show for Strauss, this predicament or crisis has no resolution within the confines of modernity. Both progress and return fail, either because in the form of progress it abandons revelation and thus religion, or in the form of return it denies politics. Alternatively, any proposed resolution fails if it denies heresy, which for Strauss is the very cornerstone of modernity, and it fails if it embraces heresy, the very antithesis of orthodoxy. For Strauss, modern rationality can never disprove orthodoxy, and orthodoxy can never disprove rationality. The liberal synthesis, either in cultural Zionism or Reform Judaism and its various branches, fails to salvage revelation even or precisely because it offers a secular or fully human rendering of it. For Strauss, progress and return remain in irreconcilable and corrosive tension. Below, I explore this conundrum, this Straussian predicament, through the prism of political Zionism as he understood it, in conversation with a thinker who tacitly acknowledged the theological-political predicament without ever mentioning it, Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar. Both Teitelbaum and Strauss understood the crisis of modernity in oddly similar ways, although they offer different solutions. Why focus on political Zionism? Strauss, who certainly supported Zionism, at least early in his career, viewed political Zionism as a kind of necessary evil of sorts, the partial solution to the pressing crisis of the survival of Jewish bodies at the expense of what he called revelation. Political Zionism wasn't heresy per se for Strauss, but it contributed to the broader phenomenon he called the pure politics of modernity, unmoored from a divine or revelatory anchor. It solved an acute physical problem for the Jews at the expense of a significant spiritual one, that is, of Judaism. Strauss wasn't making this claim as a traditionalist or as an apologist, but as an atheist, one who fully absorbed modernity but was aware of its price. As a traditionalist, Teitelbaum, on the other hand, even as an ardent anti-Zionist, could not deny that political Zionism created conditions for the survival of Jews. But for him, Zionism theologically constituted the quintessence of anti-Messianism, what he called Geula shel Shekel, because it is founded on the rejection of divine dependency and the ascendance and affirmation of the human rebellion against God, which Strauss, from a different perspective, also acknowledged. From different points on the theological-political spectrum, Strauss and Teitelbaum offered their own ways to confront the breakdown of revelation and the dangers of progress, or the secularization of revelation and the inevitability of heresy. The crisis for Strauss comes about not because of the inability of progress in the face of the loss of revelation, but because of the doubt in progress resulting from the barbarism that it produced. The erasure of biblical morality and the barbarism modernity produced for Strauss put everything in doubt. In his introduction to Philosophy and Law, Strauss puts it this way, and I quote, "Doubts about the success of civilization soon became doubts about the possibility of civilization. And the anxiety of that very possibility is enhanced by the fact that the bridge to return had already been burned. That tshuva was no longer possible for the atheist, which for Strauss makes progress structurally anti-Jewish." Teitelbaum's political theological attack on Zionism in both Vayomer Moshe and Ala Gugula Ala Tamura is presented as a closed theological political system, but it is also, in fact, based on doubt. The doubt of progress that invariably produces heresy because, and here I explain Teitelbaum in Straussian nomenclature, for Teitelbaum, political Zionism destroys Judaism in that it undermines Judaism's structural foundation. It substitutes sovereignty for exile, and thus destroys and does not fulfill the Messianic quest. Strauss supported political Zionism, but regarding its relationship to Judaism, he's quite ambiguous. I'm quoting Strauss now. But in spite of the undeniable fact that political Zionism, pure and simple, is based on a radical break with the principles of the Jewish tradition. As Daniel May recently argued, and I'm quoting him, Strauss insisted that Zionism was both a necessary for Jewish survival and fundamentally contrary to Judaism. Lior Batnitsky offers another rendering of Strauss's position on political Zionism. She writes, "The early Strauss believed political Zionism could offer a solution to the Jewish problem, and that coterminously, the solution it would offer would be a rejection of core aspects of the Jewish past. The mature Strauss would deny the first part of the proposition, in large part because he strongly questioned the desirability of the second." End quote. That's Batnitsky. Teitelbaum could never cede Strauss's point of political Zionism's solution at the expense of Judaism, as he understands Judaism as the very bulwark against the foundations of political Zionism, not only enforcing the end, but more broadly in its political project founded on atheism, while loosely integrating biblical motifs in a secularized form. Teitelbaum views modernity differently than Strauss by claiming that heresy is a necessary stage in the redemptive process, serving as a kind of antichrist that needs to be resisted. Ceding Judaism to secularism or to politics for Teitelbaum is the very antithesis of Messianism. Zionism for him is the quintessence of anti-Messianism because it substitutes political sovereignty for the Messianic idea, founded on the necessity of galut, of exile, as the context and condition of the Messianic promise. By ostensibly ending exile through human initiative, political Zionism made Messianism superfluous. And I'm going to illustrate this below in Teitelbaum's reading of Bar Kochba. Teitelbaum, like Strauss, views political Zionism as void of any moral content. For both, in a Schmittian sense, political Zionism is pure politics. In his 1923 essay on Max Nordau, Strauss writes, and I quote, "In Zionist matters, theology has no say. Zionism is purely political." End quote. But what Strauss calls political Zionism's empty shell cannot be sustained without content, and Zionists had to fill it with moral import, which they did with cultural Zionism. But for Strauss, this is no solution. The project of secularizing religion that is the backbone of cultural Zionism as a liberal project offers political Zionism moral content, but in doing so destroys the religion it draws from. And as we will see, religious Zionism, which Strauss believed inevitably replaces the failed cultural Zionist project, destroys Zionism. Because Strauss does not reject heresy or atheism, he actually embraces it, or at least he accepts it as the working reality of modernity in which political Zionism functions. Strauss can agree with the value of political Zionism without resisting it in the way Teitelbaum does, even as Strauss seems to agree with Teitelbaum's thesis of the irreconcilability of religion and Zionism, or religion and politics more generally. While Strauss does maintain that modernity cannot dissolve orthodoxy, he also maintains, unlike Teitelbaum, that orthodoxy cannot refute modernity. Strauss, in his essay on Freud, writes as follows: "The claim that God exists may remain unrefuted. As to judging its scientific value, it is nothing but one hypothesis among many others." End quote. God, as an unprovable yet irrefutable hypothesis, removes any hegemony religion may have had in the past. God survives in the plethora of possibilities. Orthodoxy may survive, but its authority has been usurped. Strauss supports political Zionism as a project of Jewish survival, even as he acknowledges it does not solve his theologico-political predicament, nor the Jewish question more generally. Rather than solve it, in many ways, political Zionism simply internalizes the Jewish question. And it can never normalize the Jews, in part because political Zionism can never quite disentangle itself from its often veiled theological claims that claim its exceptional status. For Strauss, political Zionism assures Jewish survival at the expense of undermining Judaism, in part through secularization. Political Zionism offers Jews solace and even security at the price of abandoning revelation. Thus, for Strauss, instead of encountering the de-Judaization of assimilation, Zionism actually contributes to it. Instead of assimilating into someone else's nationalism, it assimilates into its own. He wrote, Herzl, I'm quoting now, Herzl imagined the Jewish state as being exactly like a European state. But still, for Strauss, religion and political Zionism constitute a real antagonism. The abnormality of political Zionism as secular nationalism is that even against its will, it remains rooted in the biblical covenant as the cornerstone of its right to exist at all. Strauss writes in Progress and Return, the basic idea underlying purely political Zionism was not Zionism at all. It could have been satisfied by a Jewish state anywhere on earth. Political Zionism was already a concession to the Jewish tradition, end quote. Even political Zionism, he suggests, depends on a divine promise, albeit severed from its revelatory context. By contrast, he claims, and again I quote, "No one claims that faith in America and the hope of America is based on explicit divine promises." Well, I'm not sure that's actually Let's leave that for now. As Daniel May argues, according to Strauss, political Zionists were wrong to think that Judaism could simply be transformed into a nation like any other, and cultural Zionists were wrong to think that Zionism could transform Judaism into a culture like any other. That's Daniel May. Neither could sufficiently free ourselves from religion enough to do so. As a result, they both ultimately do not achieve their intended goals. By both, he means political Zionism and cultural Zionism. Although they do achieve a viable nation state, the tension of religion and the secular, Strauss survived, could not be maintained even though, or precisely because, secularization attempted to dull religion's theological edges. Strauss claimed political Zionism infused with cultural Zionism would eventually lead to religious Zionism, where the theological foundations would bubble to the surface and overtly desecularize the cultural project. Kind of prescient given our place today in the world. He writes, and I quote, "Cultural Zionism believed that it had found a middle ground between politics and divine revelation, between the subcultural and the supercultural, but it lacked the sternness of these two extremes. When cultural Zionism understands itself," this is Strauss, "when cultural Zionism understands itself, it becomes religious Zionism. But when religious Zionism understands itself, it is in the first place Jewish faith and only secondarily Zionism. It must regard as blasphemous the notion of a human solution to the Jewish problem." That's Strauss. When Zionism becomes religion on Strauss's reading, it is no longer Zionism, it is only religion. We can see this in some of the radical religious Zionists today who have eschewed the label Zionism altogether. They have become Eretz Yisraelists. Religion has effaced nationalism. Teitelbaum is on the one hand an easier nut to crack, and then Strauss, and on the other more difficult. He's easier because his theological program is laid out in elaborate detail without the ambivalences that are scattered throughout Strauss's Zionist writings. Teitelbaum is a polemicist. He is utterly convinced of his view. Strauss, on the other hand, is a diagnostician. Teitelbaum is harder to crack because his program is embedded in the arcane language of the Beit Midrash with no theorizing or self-reflection. The reader must do all the work to lift the contours of the theopolitical program from the myriad sources and halakhic analysis in which it is embedded. Below, I want to offer a brief attempt to draw out a few points worth considering in relation to Strauss's assessment I described above. Both Strauss and Teitelbaum agree on a number of things. They agree with the atheistic and heretical nature of modernity. They agree that political Zionism does not offer a solution to the Jewish question. They agree that secularizing religion through culture does not create a middle ground between revelation and reason, but serves as the demise of religion through the usurpation of revelation and the sovereignty of God. Strauss wrote, quote, "Judaism cannot be understood as a culture. The substance is not culture but divine revelation." While Strauss's rendering of culture needs some explanation, Teitelbaum would have certainly agreed that without belief in and the fidelity to the divine as the operating center of Judaism, it simply collapses. And they agree that progress is precarious and there is no return on modernity's terms. They differ in part in their positionality. Teitelbaum stands inside the tradition and thus writes as a partisan. Strauss largely stands outside the tradition and thus writes as a critic. In some way, Teitelbaum is more optimistic than Strauss that tradition can win the day, if only it is used to resist the seduction of modernity's trap, what he might call the secular and what Strauss might call the good side. While the notion that progress is precarious is obvious for Teitelbaum, what does Teitelbaum think about the impossibility of return? Teitelbaum's ultra-traditionalism is not an attempt to return to some pristine past. It is rather an attempt to stop progress in its tracks by freezing a moment in time before the theologico-political predicament presented itself. This is more than a return to Torah and mitzvot. Rather, it is what he calls Yisrael Saba, which I translate as fidelity to ancestral norms. This includes dress, language, customs, aesthetics, manner, diet, etc. It is a religio-cultural project to maintain the before times, slowing the process of heresy by resisting it as a messianic posture. It is not a passive resistance to change, but an activist protest against change in order to enable the messianic unfolding to continue unabated. It is a quintessential case of Jewish premillennialism. There's no doubt that Teitelbaum thought he was living in the end time. He deploys the term Ikvata de Mashiach often as describing his own generation. And like Cook, he too viewed Zionism as playing a role in this final phase of exile. Unlike Cook, who deemed Zionism as heretical yet necessary and thus worthy of embracing it to transform it, Teitelbaum also viewed Zionism as heresy, even necessary as a final test to be resisted. I want to give an illustration of this, of how it plays out for Teitelbaum in his understanding of Bar Kokhba. I use this example of Bar Kokhba because, as Yoel Zerubbabel argues, the transformation of Bar Kokhba from a false messiah to a national hero is an example of how Zionism inverts tradition as a solution to the problem of exile. Bar Kokhba was a military leader who led a rebellion against the Roman occupation in Jerusalem 132 CE, called by the Romans the Jewish Expedition. After some initial victories, he was appointed Prince of Judea. His last stand at Beitar resulted in immense death and destruction for Jews and ultimately ended any pretense of capturing Jerusalem. In the rabbinic imagination, centuries later, his image toggles between a military hero and a false messiah. The Talmud mentions him numerous times, the Midrash a bit more, especially in Lamentations Rabbah, changing his name from the more messianic, inflected Bar Kochba, son of a star, from the verse in Numbers 24:17, to Bar Kosiba, son of a deceiver, because even though he ostensibly said, I am the Messiah, he turned out to be a false Messiah and responsible for the death of many thousands of Jews. There's little commemoration of Bar Kochba's insurrection in normative Judaism, and what does exist was folded, interestingly, until the modern period, or until the rise of Zionism, into Tisha B'Av. What Zionism does is transfers Bar Kochba as being commemorated in Tisha B'Av to Bar Kochba as being commemorated in Lag BaOmer. While rabbinic literature is of two minds about Bar Kochba, Teitelbaum focuses on his negative depiction, which was arguably dominant, a false messiah responsible for Jewish tragedy and the prolonged decree of exile. With this in mind, it's worth asking why Bar Kochba was so important for Teitelbaum in his attack on Zionism. In fact, as is widely known, the Zionist revision of Jewish history revives Bar Kochba not as a failed messiah, but as the quintessence of Jewish heroism. On this, it's worth quoting Yoel Zerubbabel. She writes as follows: the transformation of Bar Kochba from a dubious leader to a failed revolt to a prominent heroic figure from antiquity is an important feature of the Zionist reshaping of the past. The Zionist commemorative narrative thus shifts its focus from the outcome of the revolt to the act of revolting. It emphasizes the initial success that brought about the liberation of Judea rather than the defeat that led to its exile. Bar Kochba valorizes war, which any nation-state must incorporate into its self-fashion. Teitelbaum's interest in Bar Kochba is focused on the notion of the fact that Rabbi Akiva, the quintessential rabbinic hero, apparently acceded to Bar Kochba's messianic claim. The link connecting Bar Kochba to Zionism is that both exercise their messianic claim by attempting to return to the land, quote, before its time. A question that haunts the tradition is who actually killed Bar Kochba. The passage in Sanhedrin 93b that mentions his death does not specify who killed him, yet some Midrashim claim that he was killed by the Jews. Maimonides in his Law of Kings 11:3 simply cites the Talmudic passage and leaves his death ambiguous. Lamentations Rabbah 2:4 says it appears that the Gentiles killed him, and Don Isaac of Barbanel in his Yeshuat Meshicho and David ibn Zamra both suggest that even if the Jews did not kill Bar Kochba, they sentenced him to death. In any event, Teitelbaum uses all this to make a somewhat shocking claim that thinly veils his view of Zionism as a case of false messianism or anti-messianism likened to Bar Kochba. In a sense, Teitelbaum is taking Zionism on its own terms, linking itself to Bar Kochba and then inverting it as the basis of his critique. Teitelbaum suggests, following the narrative suggested by Abarbanel, that we know very little about Bar Kochba from Jewish texts, while there's much more written about it in Roman chronicles and medieval anti-Jewish Christian polemics that tell of his great military prowess, including sojourns to Alexandria, Rome, Babylonia, and so on and so forth. Thus, he served as a great support for the Jews, saving them from their enemies. That's the way Teitelbaum describes it. When Bar Kochba was killed, the opposite occurred. In retribution, the Midrash relates, the enemies of the Jews killed many more Jews than even perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. Here are the references to Beitar. The death of Bar Kochba was thus a time of extreme danger for the Jews. Since that was the case, Teitelbaum asks, it's hard to understand why the sages killed him. They must have known that since Bar Kochba was such a successful warrior, the enemies of the Jews would take revenge once he was gone, and thus his death would present a grave danger, as indeed occurred, according to our sins. The sages, Teitelbaum claims, were presented with a theological-political dilemma. Put otherwise, a kind of crisis. They were confronted with a false Messiah who was saving Jews. If they killed him, and as a false Messiah he should have been killed, according to the rabbis, they knew that they would suffer from the revenge of their enemies. And if they did not kill him and allowed him to continue his expedition, redemption could not come, because they would have been supporting a false Messiah. And supporting a false Messiah is precisely that which prevents the arrival of the true one. Responding to this, Teitelbaum writes as follows, and this is a quote from Yoel. Therefore, the rabbi saw that he was not the Messiah, and thus his political project had come too early. It created a grave danger to the Jews. Who knows what more could occur had they allowed his political quest to continue? Thus, the sages chose the lesser of two evils, and they killed him, destroying his political aspirations with it. This was viewed as a small salvation. One who thinks carefully about this can see where all this has come with a political reality before Messiah, for it is indeed terrible. End quote. A false Messiah who acts as a savior, but creates a danger that far outweighs the danger if he is not removed. Thus, the sages are forced to choose between the lesser of two evils in this theological-political predicament, knowing that removing Bar Kokhba's protective shield may result in imminent danger to the Jews. But what will remain intact is a firm belief in the promise of redemption. In short, a false Messiah that protects Jews is worse than no Messiah that doesn't. Because only the latter truly can protect the belief in the Messianic promise. For Teitelbaum, believing in a false Messiah erases the belief in the true Messiah, and in doing so prevents the true Messiah in the future, because the Jews have already ceased believing in it. Teitelbaum is fully aware of the saving nature of the state of Israel after the trauma of the Nazi genocide. And thus I think he would cede Strauss's notion, if pushed, that political Zionism does solve the proximate problem of the physical danger of the Jews. But for him, I think, and for Strauss as well, in a different register, the saving qualities of Zionism hide a much more ominous danger, the erasure of belief in the promise of redemption. Or, as Strauss might say, the erasure in the belief in the sovereignty of God. Thus, the Talmud teaches us the sin of Bar Kokhba's generation was, quote, not sufficiently mourning the temple. That's what the Talmud in Sanhedrin says. Or, as Teitelbaum puts it elsewhere in rabbinic parlance, pashtu yedechem mizvu. They washed their hands from the temple. The saving as well as destructive power of Bar Kokhba's prowess was the belief that the redemption is in human hands. For Teitelbaum, believing in a false Messiah, even if he stands in service of the Jews, is worse than no Messiah at all. Any salvation would be temporary by definition precisely because it is not messianic, but rather it is anti-messianic. With a deep sense of both irony and tragedy, Teitelbaum's view is that if we don't have a state, we are in danger. And if we do have a state built on the foundations of a false Messiah or false messianic premises, we are in more perilous danger, albeit not purely physical. The first state of danger results from the efficacy of human agency through abandoning dependence on the divine, which that's what Strauss calls political Zionism. The second state of danger, however, while it may put Jewish bodies in harm's way, maintains the requisite belief in redemption, what he calls emunah b'geula, that comes through waiting for divine intervention and a messianic figure who meets the necessary criteria for that vocation. For Teitelbaum, what conceals false messianism is pure survivalism, or put in Schmittian terms, pure politics. Or in Strauss's language, pure politics as well. The grace of true messianism is faith, or as Strauss might put it, a return to revelation. I think this largely coheres with Leo Strauss's review of Max Nordau's Zionism, where Strauss notes on Nordau, Zionism retains the separation affected by assimilation between Zionism and Messianism, between national world ends and spiritual means, but it abandons Messianism. End quote. The great tragedy of false Messianism is not the fallacy per se, but the erasure of the belief in the Messianic idea. For Teitelbaum, this is one of the lasting tragedies of political Zionism. If you are a sovereign without Messiah, who needs Messiah? For this reason, on Teitelbaum's reading, the sages had to kill Bar Kokhba even as they knew it would put them in danger. And Teitelbaum claims that they made the right choice. Therein, in my view, lies the crisis of modernity for both Strauss and Teitelbaum. The heresy of modernity and the Enlightenment largely put humanity's fate in human hands. If the results would have been immediately disastrous, no crisis would have ensued, and return may have even been possible. But that was not the case. In fact, quite the opposite. The barbarity of modernity would take some time to manifest, after much of society had been convinced of its efficacy. Thus, the evil of Nazism was such a shock to the enlightened system. By that time, Strauss has it, there was no return. As Strauss explicitly notes regarding political Zionism, its success regarding Jewish bodies cannot be denied, but the theological problems it introduces, its overt rejection of revelation on the one hand, and the tacit adaptation of biblical motifs on the other, would serve to undermine it in two ways. First, political Zionism could never normalize the Jews, and as its national project remains so too entangled in theological suppositions, even if he may deny them. And second, those tacit biblical motifs that are secularized in cultural Zionism through the mechanisms of liberalism will invariably bubble to the surface in religious Zionism and become prominent enough that Zionism will succumb to the religion. Or, as Daniel may suggest, like the Ouroboros, political Zionism will consume itself. For Teitelbaum, the crisis, or his theological-political predicament, is embedded in the seduction of progress whereby Jews were led to believe that religion can survive as an integrated part of modernity, in his case, through the political project of Zionism. The temptation of Zionism is precisely that it seems to solve the problem of survival, when in fact, for him, it does so at the expense of the covenant. But as we saw in his reading of Bar Kokhba, this is not a uniquely modern predicament, but one deeply rooted in Jewish civilization. Historically, Zionism for him is simply its latest iteration. The ancestral Masorah, or Yisrael Saba, is what can resist this proximate and final test. That is, it can slow progress by freezing a moment in time as a way to pledge fidelity to ancestral norms and thereby prevent, or at least postpone, the collapse of revelation into the hands of human agency. Yisrael Saba is not true or even holy in any normative sense. It's a necessary response to progress whose road, as Teitelbaum reads it, is a road to perdition and a road away from and not toward Messianism. Teitelbaum functions in a full-bodied premillennial mindset, providing a model for survival of the remnant to be redeemed in the future. Strauss takes another path by returning to the medievals, to a rationality not yet severed from revelation in an attempt to construct a solution to a predicament produced by modernity, but one which modernity cannot solve. The only hope for Strauss was to step outside the parameters of modern thought. Through communal norms or through an alternative intellectual project, Teitelbaum and Strauss struggled to come to terms with the theologico-political predicament. Each see as threatening the survival of Judaism, even as that dilemma may procure the survival of the Jews.